Well, I don't know about you, but I get tired after a while of the phone calls that I get that tell me I've won a free trip someplace. And it's all mine. All I have to do is call up the travel agent, give them a bunch of information, promise them that I'll come to some seminar, and that I can claim my free trip. I guess there was a time a lot of years ago, I won't ask you to do the math, when I might have thought, woohoo, I got a free trip. Now, I don't feel that way. I find myself asking, yeah, what's in it for them? I get letters like that, you've just won a great sum of money, or emails. Contact us right away. And like the free trips, I found out that what's in it for the people on the other end. And that's why we have the slogan, if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. And that builds up a certain degree of cynicism. We're suspicious of good news sometimes, out of the blue. Now, sometimes people will look at folks in the ancient world and say, yeah, well, back then they were a little more gullible, a little more naive. They were easily tricked. They believed certain ideas. But friends, when you read the literature back in the day, back in the first century, you find out that cynicism was ancient just like it's modern. People were very familiar with itinerant teachers who came along, or salespersons who tried to make a living by offering people and hearers wisdom for life, fresh insights, magic elixirs, or a new philosophy. They came and they went. People in the crowds would hear them. They'd say, oh, when's the other shoe going to drop? When are we going to find out what's in it for the person making those claims? The Apostle Paul was aware of just that challenge. And of course, what's Paul but an itinerant preacher and teacher? So when he and his companions arrive at a new town, and particularly here in this letter to Thessalonica, and begin telling a strange story that's promising something exciting, new life, they are aware that there can be problems associated with that as people in the crowd wait to listen, to hear what's in it for them, what's in it for Paul, what's in it for his companions. That's why Paul is clear in this letter, which is most likely the earliest Christian writing we have, not just the New Testament, but at all. Paul is clear that his motives for sharing the good news are not and must not be impure. He and his companions are not in it for material gain, personal benefit. In fact, Paul says in other places that, well, people who make their living preaching the gospel certainly have a right to, who spend their time preaching the gospel, have a right to make a living from that. He says, I'm not going to do that. I don't want any sense that I'm benefiting from this, or this is about what I'm doing. So he, as we know, made tents to pay his own way. Not only that, not only did he pay his own way, far from this message being good for him, helping him, he says, I got opposition. People oppose me, right here at the beginning of these verses that we read. He talks about this situation in Philippi. There's opposition. In fact, he's undergoing suffering for the sake of this message. Particularly if we read further in Thessalonians, in this letter, we'd find out that opposition came from people that we might have thought would be Paul's friends. People that Paul might have thought would be his friends. Other religious leaders. who didn't like Paul's message. What didn't they like about it? Well, who's getting in? Who's part of this message of grace that Paul's telling? Well, gosh, it's open to everybody, even the Gentiles. We've talked a lot about that. What do you have to do to be the beneficiary of this? Here might be the part where Paul, no, you don't do anything but have faith. It's not about being in the right community, doing things the right way. This is a radical gospel, and Paul is clear that he's not benefiting at all. In fact, he's taking opposition. He's suffering for the sake of this message. But here's the amazing part in the midst of all that. Because you'd think that that doesn't sound like a great life. You're carrying out this message, you're being persecuted, you're incurring the anger of religious leaders and other folks, you're paying your own way. Wait, not much of a life, and yet Paul says that he has a sense of joy and freedom. Joy and freedom in the midst of this. How's that possible? Well, Paul's pretty clear about how that's possible. Because at the heart of everything, the approval that he's seeking is not from human beings, but from God. That's the approval he's seeking, from God, not human beings. Over and over again in this text that we've read tonight, that Stafford read, Paul speaks of God. Just in these few verses, he was bold in God. He preached the gospel of God. He had been approved by God. He was aiming simply to please God. With God as his witness, he was not greedy. He was not trying to gain something for himself. In fact, quite the contrary. He's willing to suffer loss for the sake of this message because he believes this message is so important that he wants to get out. He wants to tell the story. He wants to tell this good news, which he believes is the best news anybody could hear. And just to make sure that nobody would think, oh yeah, he's telling this good news because he benefits. He gains. He goes the extra mile to show that that's not the case. He had a deep sense of conviction that God had entrusted him with this message, that God had entrusted him with this gospel. Just like a monarch back in the ancient world would entrust a messenger to take an announcement far away. Paul said his responsibility is just to deliver the message, not to benefit from it, not to accrue standing for himself, not to think about his own place, not to carefully tailor the message just so it benefits him, not to appease people that were opposing him. His job is simply to deliver a message. And a pretty simple one, although he goes to considerable lengths in some of his letters to argue it. It's a pretty straightforward message. It's a message about God's love that extends to all people. Like we talked about last week, it's a message that breaks down barriers. It's a message of welcome, of good news. And as a result, Paul says he's humble and gentle. He can afford to be. He doesn't have to constantly consider his place. He can be loving. And he appeals to the Thessalonians. They remember that about him. Remember how I was amongst you. I sometimes think about that in the world today when I'm listening to debates, whether it's in religion or politics or something else. When people start getting angry and defensive, you start to wonder what's behind the message. Yet when people are gentle and calm and relaxed, there's a greater sense that they have confidence. Paul simply wants his hearers to know the love of God. That's fundamental to the gospel. Now, sadly, as we well know, that has often not been the case in the history of the Christian faith that Paul helped to spread. We can think of lots of stories in Christian history where communities, Christian communities, proclaimed a message that definitely was for their benefit and not so much for the benefit of others. We've said it before, and we'll probably be talking about it a lot this year. 500th anniversary of the Reformation. How did this whole thing get started? And you probably know that Martin Luther, posted this 95 Theses on the door of a church in Wittenberg. What a lot of you may not be aware of is just what that was about. What were those theses that Luther wanted to debate and argue about? And they all had to do with the sale of indulgences. As we're aware, the church in Luther's day was pretty well off, and they had some big building programs that they wanted to fund. Want to keep doing some building. Somebody had an idea, you know what? If we sell indulgences, we can fund this building program. What's an indulgence? Long story short, you could spend some money, and on behalf of yourself in the future or on behalf of a loved one, you could buy time out of purgatory. Right? So there were salespersons that went around selling these things. One of the most famous is a German named Johannes Tetzel, who had a clever little jingle. Said, as soon as a coin in the coffer rings, another soul from purgatory springs. Yeah, you hear that? As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, another soul from purgatory springs. Step right up. You can buy one for yourself down the road when when you pass on. You can buy one for a loved one. And the church building programs boomed. And Martin Luther came along, much like the Apostle Paul, and said, wait a minute, that's not what this message is about. It's not about who's rich enough to buy an indulgence. It's not about who does things the right way. It's not who's in right standing with the right people. No, Luther, like Paul, offered a simple message. This good news comes to us by grace alone. Only by the grace of God. Only through God. And from that we get one of the great slogans of the Reformation, sola gratia, if you want the Latin. Grace alone, by grace alone. The good news comes by grace alone. The news that Paul had been entrusted with is that the love of God is extended to us only by grace. That means we are accepted by God not because of the quality of our lives, not because of the charitable things we've done, but only because of God's unmerited favor, only because God loves us. In the words of Tavis Smiley, just because because of who God is. We can't earn God's favor. It's great that you're here tonight. It doesn't help your standing before God. There's nothing you can do to make God love you more. But here's the other side. There's nothing you can do to make God love you less either. The grace of God made known in Jesus Christ extends to all people. And no one, no matter where they've been or what they've done, is beyond the reach of God's redeeming love. It's free. There's nothing you can do to make it more or make it less. That's good news, friends. That's the best news we could hear. That means wherever you are tonight, whatever's happening in your life, whatever those things might be that sometimes can make you feel ashamed, or maybe feel that somehow you're not worth, that's not true. God loves you. And that will never change. That's the good news about this gospel. Here's the responsibility that goes with that, for as we've been entrusted with this good news, is that we are called to extend this good news and forgiveness to others like ourselves. To people in our lives that we may think, boy, they really aren't a very nice person. They really don't do the things the right way. The places they've been and the things they've done. Friends, God loves them. God has hopes and dreams. That's our responsibility, to proclaim that good news. Part of the challenge is, as Paul discovered, sometimes the proclamation of that message that we've been entrusted with, that good news, will be costly. It won't be easy. You think to yourself, boy, what could be costly about that? Friends, just like in Paul's day, and we see it all around us, there's people that don't want to hear that message. They want to believe that somehow other people aren't worthy. And of course, I'm sure that underneath that is because what they really want to say is, look at me or look at us, how worthy we are over against those other folks. Jesus talked about this. Remember the one who went and prayed, Lord, I thank you that I'm not a sinner like these other people. And it's costly. It's costly. It's costly saying, look, how you vote or who you support in an election doesn't shift your standing before God. We may feel strongly, we may be confident that God's direction is different than what this party says or that party says, but I hear all the time, you can't vote that way and really be a Christian. If you vote like that, whichever way that might be, somehow you're really not on God's side. That's not this message. That doesn't mean that we don't need to raise challenges along the way, but we can't make claims like, if you want this good news, if you're really participating in it, then you'll do things this way, which generally comes down to be the way the person talking wants you to do them. No, this is the free gift of God in Jesus Christ, which extends to all people. Black, red, yellow, white, rich, poor, Democrat, Republican, gay, straight. All people. And friends, we've been entrusted with sharing that news in the world today. So as we think on this message, let us rejoice and give thanks that God loves us, that God forgives us. But let's, in the midst of that, accept the responsibility that we have, just because God's been that way with us, that we're the people in the world that are called to love unconditionally and to forgive as we've been forgiven. May God give us the strength to live in such a way that, like Paul, we can stand before God as people who have been faithful in keeping and proclaiming this gospel that has been entrusted to us. Amen.